if I can, with some Middle Eastern Mesopotamian history. How many of you guys like the Middle Eastern Mesopotamian history? Okay, all right, good. You're a smarter crowd than first service, but that's all right. It's later in the day, and it's hard to take Middle Eastern Mesopotamian history really early in the day. In the year 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar rolled through Israel. And really, if you were focusing on that part of the world in that time, you really wouldn't have noticed Israel in the middle of it at all. Nebuchadnezzar had a big battle with Pharaoh in Egypt, and it was the Battle of Carchemish, and Egypt lost. Egypt, really before that, had pretty good control over that whole region. And after they lost to Nebuchadnezzar at Carchemish, Pharaoh went back across the river, the Nile River, and he never really came out again. He pretty much stayed in his little area there. And Egypt never really came back again as a world power, really after that defeat by Nebuchadnezzar. And when he pushed Egypt back there, he conquered all the things that Egypt had controlled or had controlling economic interest in, including Jerusalem. And he made the king of Jerusalem his vassal for a couple of years, and he took the best and the brightest people out of Jerusalem and took them to Babylon with the intention of turning those people into Babylonians. He wanted to take the best, the smartest, the brightest, and make them into good Babylonian citizens. Nebuchadnezzar's thinking was, is that it would make Babylon stronger. You know, he did to all the different cities that he conquered, and he thought it would make the city stronger. And four of the people that were taken were Daniel, in that first deal in 605 BC, Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. And they pop up, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego pop up in other stories. But Daniel is the main guy that I kind of want to focus on there. And he's taken to God, and he becomes a hero, biblically speaking. When you're looking at the different people who were heroes in that time period, Daniel stands out. I mean, one prophet later will compare him favorably to Job or Noah and say that this is one of the most righteous guys who ever lived. But Daniel never becomes more than a slave. Now, when you think of slavery, of course, it's hard in America not to think of the American South and that experience. And this was different than that. Daniel achieves some level of notoriety. Daniel achieves a lot of power, but he's always the slave of the king of Babylon. That never changes. The rest of his life, he never advances beyond that. And you see him and Nebuchadnezzar have kind of a back and forth. You know, Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful king, really, who had ever been to that point. But Daniel's challenging him all the time. And Nebuchadnezzar would have these great bouts of pride. He builds a great statue, probably to himself, and it demands everybody worship it. And he gets so proud of himself once that God even afflicts him on purpose with a disease, a mental disease, to try to wake him up. And it seems like Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel have a relationship. And I stopped short of saying that Nebuchadnezzar becomes a Christian, or becomes a believer, wouldn't be a Christian. Becomes a believer. There's no Christian yet because the cross is still several hundred years away, but becomes maybe it's possible. He certainly says some nice things about God, and it seems like he goes back and forth to at least giving respect to the God of Israel, whether or not he fully believes in it or not. Nebuchadnezzar, during all of that time, continues to raid Israel. There's two other big events where he attacks Israel until finally, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, and finally in 586 BC, he flattens the temple and takes all of the stuff out of the temple back to Babylon. We think probably at that point that's where the Ark of the Covenant is probably destroyed right then. We think that's when, if you may have seen the movie and thought it was in a warehouse in Washington, and probably it's not. It probably was destroyed then because God had left all of it. And suddenly, instead of being the powerful Ark, it's just a box. And Nebuchadnezzar strips all the gold off of it and strips all the gold off of the temple and everything of value he takes back to Babylon. And he lives and dies. And after he dies, his son takes over just for a couple of years, evil Marduk, and he doesn't last very long. And then his son, or another guy kills him. It's not his son. Another guy kills evil Marduk and becomes king, but he's only king for a little bit there. And then a king named Nabonidus comes along. And Nabonidus is a great big king, and he's really powerful and strong. Not as powerful as Nebuchadnezzar, but he's really powerful and strong, and he does a lot of powerful things. But he has trouble the whole time he's king because Cyrus, the king of the Persians, is coming. And so if you think about Babylon being kind of where Iraq is and Persia kind of being where Iran is, and Persia is invading and they're attacking. And so Nabonidus starts to share his kingdom. He's still the king, but he takes his son Belshazzar and makes him kind of a co-regent. They're kings together, right? And so Belshazzar stays in Babylon and watches the city, and Nabonidus, his father, goes out and fights Cyrus, who's coming, and he loses terribly. There's a battle in 539 BC, and he loses terribly. Loses so badly that he flees for his life. Nabonidus does, and takes whatever little bit of army he has left and goes as far south away from Cyrus as he can. And he leaves his son and the rest of the army in Babylon. And Cyrus is the more powerful king. He's already beaten most of the army of Babylon, and he's coming, and his son Belshazzar's there in Babylon waiting. But his son doesn't fear, because Babylon was thought of as an unconquerable city. It had gigantic walls. You could race 3 chariots side by side on the walls of Babylon. The Euphrates River went under the wall and through the city, so they would always have a fresh supply of water. They believed that the city could never be conquered. And so, as Cyrus's armies are approaching, Belshazzar throws a big party. And there's a lot of drinking and a lot of people getting drunk. And finally, maybe in the midst of getting drunk, he tells his servants to bring the gold cups and stuff that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Israel, taken from the temple all those years ago. Bring those cups out. Let's drink out of those. And apparently Nebuchadnezzar had never drank out of those. This is apparently a pretty big deal. Nebuchadnezzar had never done that. And neither had his son, and neither had the guy who replaced his son. But Nabonidus' son, Belshazzar, he's going to do it. I'm going to drink out of these cups. And it says, as he starts to drink out of the gold cups that were from the temple, that a hand appears against the wall, and it writes on the wall 4 words, mene, tekel, parsin. And those words can be money words, a minus and a tekel, a shekel were it could be that. Parsin sounds kind of like Persia, and it could be a reference to that. But whatever it is, they can't tell what's going on. The guys reading it can't tell. And it says the whole sight of it, the ghostly hand. It's one of the spookiest, as far as spooky miracles. It's probably the spookiest miracle I can think of in the Bible. And it really it freaks out the king of Babylon. It says he loses control of his bodily functions. He tells anybody who can figure out what that hand's about and what it has to say, I'll make them the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. And nobody can. And the queen mother comes out. And not the queen, but maybe the mother of one of the, or wife of one of the, could be the wife of Nebuchadnezzar, but the queen mother comes out, and she says, don't be alarmed. There's a guy in your kingdom who can figure this stuff out. Daniel can do this. And apparently after Nebuchadnezzar was gone, all of Nebuchadnezzar's people were kind of sent away. You see that even in America, when the president is gone, that person's cabinet is not kept. You send all those people away, and the new person brings in all their people. And probably that had happened to Daniel. So when Nebuchadnezzar's gone, Daniel kind of shifts off to the background. And by this point of the story, he's close to 80 or maybe even 90 years old. And they they call Daniel in. And Belshazzar's suspicious of it. He says, I've heard that you can help with this sort of thing. I understand that you know about this stuff. But he doesn't really give him total credit for it. And he says, if you can explain it to me, what that hand's about and what the words are about, I'll make you the ruler, 3rd ruler of the kingdom. Which is a big deal, because like the first ruler was Nabonidus, and then Belshazzar, his son, and then Daniel would be right there. And Daniel says, I'm not interested in any rewards, but I'll tell you what it's about. He says, it's about you, king. You saw how Nebuchadnezzar was, and you knew about him. I don't mean actually saw it physically, but you knew how he was, and he was proud, and God humbled him, and God used him because he would humble him, because he wouldn't have pride. And then he says this, and I wrote this down so you can read it with me here. He says, but you, Belshazzar, his son, you've not humbled yourself, even though you knew about all that stuff, and really didn't just know about that, but knows that Cyrus is coming. Knows that his father's already lost, knows that his father's running for his life. He's in this big city, and he has all this confidence. Well, they can't get in here, and you knew all this. But instead of being humble, he says, you set yourself up against the God of heaven. He says you had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles and wives and concubines drank wine from them. He says you praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which can't see or hear or understand, but you didn't honor God, who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. And that last sentence is really why I got into all this history to begin with. That he says, it's God that holds. I mean, you may think of yourself as a pretty important guy, but it's God that really controls this stuff. And you don't have control of these things, and you can't decide. If you woke up this morning, that's a gift. I mean, with all the different virus and everything going on, but not just the virus. I mean, every week it seems like I hear about somebody in our church or connected to our church who's just in a desperate situation they didn't see coming. And we all know somewhere in the back of our minds how fragile we are, but even though we know all that, we too sometimes can become more focused on the things we can see, the gold and silver and stone and wood and everything else around us, than we are on God in heaven. And he holds our lives in his hands. And we know that, but we don't always live like it. And for Belshazzar, the punishment for that is intense. He says, Daniel, after this says, this very night, you're going to die. This very night, you're going to lose everything. And I'm guessing when he told Belshazzar that, he didn't really believe it. He thought there's no way. And if you're not, again, familiar with that history, it's kind of an interesting thing that what Cyrus did, the river ran through the city, so you couldn't besiege it. So he just dammed up the river. The Euphrates is one of the 4 biggest rivers in the world. I don't know how big a deal it would be to dam up the river, but he did. And he dams up the river, and they just went through the riverbank under the wall and conquered the city in one night. I think about that with like the Titanic. You know, when anybody says something is unsinkable or unbeatable, that should always give you some pause. You know, as smart as we are, we haven't been able to figure out a way to cheat death yet. We haven't been able to figure a way to guarantee safety, to guarantee survival. And that's what happens to Belshazzar. And he didn't humble himself. He didn't keep in mind his own limitations and who he was. It reminds me of a proverb. Now, you probably know the King James Version, maybe more, pride goeth before a fall, it says in King James. But here in NIV, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And when we allow ourselves to get cocky and arrogant and proud of ourselves, it's just a matter of time before something falls apart. My dad and I were doing some really basic car repair, because I'm not very smart about that. But we're doing some really basic car repair, and it was going pretty well. Everything that I was doing was working, and he was teasing me about how fast I was getting. I said, don't do that. As soon as I get cocky, that's usually when it all falls apart. You know, usually when I think I got it whipped, that's when everything comes unglued. And that proverb, I think that's applied to me, but it certainly applied to Belshazzar all those years ago. I mean, in that moment when he should have been praying the very most to God, God, I need you. He just had too much confidence in himself, and he lost everything. Jesus says something very similar too. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 12, he says, for those who exalt themselves, they're going to be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And I think this is kind of a rule of life. I think this is how the world generally works. I think when you put yourself in the right frame of mind, you know, you know who you are, you know your limitations, you know what you can and can't do, you know who God is. I think God sees a person like that. And I think the person who on purpose makes their life about putting others first and putting God first, I think God has a way of exalting that person. Truthfully, not just in heaven, but even here sometimes. I mean, where on the other hand, the person who constantly talks about themselves, constantly brags about who they are, I mean, we see those people being unpopular. Nobody wants to spend time with somebody like that because of how they are. I think it's kind of a rule of life, but it's certainly a heaven and hell thing too. God's watching, and the person who's humble, he's one day going to reward powerfully. Now, we've been looking the last few weeks at this verse behind me in Micah. And we took the first week just to look at that verse in Micah, and then the last 3 weeks, this week included, to talk about those 3 things. He's shown you how to be good. He's shown you what he requires. He wants you to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly. And we looked the first week, or the second week there, at acting justly and what justice means biblically. We looked the second week at mercy, the word hesed in the Bible, and what that means and how we're supposed to love that. And then this week I want to talk about this walking humbly. And actually, this is the one I'm most nervous about of all of them. I thought it was possible I could make some people mad with the justice one. I don't know if I did or not. And I thought it was possible I could affect some people with the mercy one. But this one's a hard one, mostly because most people don't think they struggle with this one. Most people think that by and large, on this one, they're doing okay. I mean, they may not be the most humble dude in the whole world, but this is not a big problem for me. It's very easy in your head to check the box on this one and say, okay, got it, and not really think about it. And in my opinion, this is the one that most all of us struggle with. This is the one that mostly knocks us down. It's this one that has a way of upsetting everything, and I think most of us are blind to it. I don't think it means, when it says being humble, it means you've got to think of yourself as less than necessarily. If you're good at something, it's okay to admit you're good at it. You know, it's okay if you do that. If you've got a natural talent for whatever, and somebody, you know, it's okay to admit that. I used to tease my grandma. She would put this huge meal in front of us, and it was always awesome. Every part of it was awesome. But she'd spend the whole time talking about how it wasn't fit to eat, you know. And, oh, don't eat that. Oh, that's dry. Oh, you don't want that. I didn't like how that turned out. And every part of it was incredible. And so I found this for me too. After when I first started preaching, every once in a while it would go well, and I would be in the back greeting people afterward, and somebody might say, hey, that's a great sermon. And I would do the same thing my grandma did, but about the sermon. Oh, no, it really wasn't that good. And it did the same thing it did for my grandma. What it invites people is people say, oh, no. It was great. And I'd say, oh, no, really. No, it was wonderful. Oh, no, I went too long. Oh, no, you could have went longer. And so what it did is just invited them to keep going on, which might have been the hidden agenda for me all along. I didn't plan on it, but it just made it go on and on and on. And so I finally got to where if somebody ever said something nice about it, I would just, hey, thanks. And we just go on, come back next week. I'll change your mind. But I wouldn't go on and on about it because it just made it go on and on and on. And humble is not about you doing that. If you're naturally good at whatever, it's okay to know that. If somebody says you're doing great, it's okay to know you did great. It's okay if you don't have to deny it and go on. It's more about just knowing who you are, though. No matter what you do well, or no matter who you are, you still need God, and you're still dependent on God, and He holds our lives in His hands, and that the people that I'm surrounded by are precious, and they're all made in His image, and I should be much more interested in what they're doing than bragging about myself. It's more perspective, this walking humbly. And I think God cares about it so much because when we don't do it, we're telling God we don't need Him. One of the most obvious indicators of pride in a Christian's life is if you never pray and you never read your Bible just to figure out what God wants you to do. You just don't ever do it. Or when you do it, it's such a tremendous chore. And the whole time you're doing it, you're just thinking, I could be anywhere else but here. And you can't force yourself, because it's just such a bother for you to do it. And whenever that happens, and I've been through that, I'm not hopefully throwing stones at you. I know what that feels like. And every time I do that, or every time you do that, you're just telling God, I don't need you today, God. If I do need you, I know where you're at. But I don't need you. And you'd never say that to somebody else. I mean, I can't imagine a husband telling a wife that, or a wife telling a husband that, or a boyfriend or girlfriend, and they're getting closer and closer to one another. And then one romantic night, he says, "I won't need you for the next week or two. I've got other things going on, but I know where you're at when I do." You'd never do that. But we do it with God all the time. And when we do it with God, we make Him an enemy. When James talks about God opposing the proud, that's what it's talking about. When we make God an enemy and He's our only lifeline out of this world, He opposes that. And I don't know what that looks like exactly. I think it probably goes back to what Jesus said earlier. The one who exalts himself will be humbled. I think it probably goes back to that. God, and again, what I found even in mechanic stuff, that by the time I think I've got it whipped, God has a way of reminding me that it's not nearly as whipped as I thought that it was. Pride is the oldest sin. If you look back at the very beginning, when Eve and Adam are tempted to eat the fruit there, the temptation is, eat this and you will be like God. You won't need God anymore. You'll be like God. And it was such a seductive thing then and now. And it's easy to get into our skin, and we don't always see it. So John Ortberg wrote a book called The Life You Always Wanted a long time ago, and he had a couple things on this that I thought were interesting. The first one was the different types of pride. and I thought this was interesting. You could probably divide pride up more thinly than I have here, but the most obvious form of pride is vanity. Vanity is when, and everybody struggles with this a little bit. Vanity is a big family picture is taken of you and the whole family at Thanksgiving, and you're all in the picture, and they ask you, they took it on, maybe took it on their phone, and they say, hey, look, is that a good picture? Who do you look at to determine if it's a good picture? All right? And really, everybody else in there could look beautiful, and you've got your eyes closed, so we need to take it again, right? Everybody on there could look awesome, but you made a funny face, so we got to do it one more time. Because we define what a good picture is by how we look in it. And it's not just, it's vanity's a lot of things like that. It's just silly stuff. It's irritating. We wish we weren't like that, but we are. You know, some people, their vanity goes to their intellect. They like to argue and debate. They always want to be seen as the smartest guy in the room. And I read another guy on Twitter this week said, if you're always the smartest guy in the room, you should get out more. And I think that's true. I think that's a bad sign. Vanity is when you're always worried about how you're coming off. You watch social media and you grade how you're doing as a human being by how many likes and attention and all that different stuff. And there's 1,000 different ways to do it. And it's all mostly harmless. It is. It's irritating. We wish it wasn't there. But in the big scheme of things, it's not super serious pride. Stubbornness is a step further than that. Stubbornness is, I don't take direction well. I mean, I can be in the middle of whatever bad thing I'm doing, but whenever anybody tries to tell me what I'm doing, I kind of get offended by that. You can tell a person has a struggle with that if when you try to help them with it, they immediately get defensive. You know, like, hey, I noticed you didn't fill the car up with gasoline. Well, you don't know what my day was like yesterday, and it's just this whole thing, as opposed to just saying, yeah, I didn't. You know, yeah, I forgot. Or, yeah, I was just too busy. It's like this huge thing. Everything's a big, you know, they can't ever say they're sorry for anything because they're not sorry for anything. Nothing's ever their fault. If you tell them to do something or change something or fix something, if they're really a Christian and they're aware of what humbleness should look like, they might say something like, oh, listen, I see what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying, but then they tell you why they were right all along. Proverbs 29:1 says, whoever remains stiff-necked after many rebukes will suddenly be destroyed without remedy. And sometimes those voices that are telling you to change, that's God speaking through them. And it takes a lot of discernment to know when that is God and when it's not. I know that. It takes a lot of discernment to know when it's wisdom and when it's not. But a person who's stubborn, they don't take direction very well. One thing that's hard about this list, as I'm telling it to you, most of the people who really struggle with stubbornness, even as I talk about it, are not aware that it's them. But the people sitting with them know. Or it could be this. When it's really bad, it makes you start excluding people. You're only about yourself. You just don't have time for other people. Not really, not unless they're producing something for you. And it's very easy to treat people, especially people who you don't have to interact with very often, as disposable. I can tell if a person has a lot of pride by how they treat people who serve them, how they act to the waitress or the mechanic or the barber or the whoever else. I mean, I can see if they're just impatient and indifferent and mean, you can see it. That pride just leaks out of them. C.S. Lewis, when he talked about hell, he believes in hell that the most interesting people will try to get as far away from everybody else as they can. Even in hell, it'll be hard to find the really fun people to hang out with because they don't want to hang out with anybody. Pride, when it really gets a hold of your heart, it just makes you full of yourself. And it's hard for anybody else to creep in there. It's all about your comparison and your rank. There's a story in the Bible Jesus tells about a Pharisee and a tax collector who go to pray at the same time. And they're both in front of the altar and they're both praying. And the Pharisee sees the tax collector and says, God, I thank you, I'm not like that. You know? And you'd never pray like that out loud. You wouldn't. You would never say that out loud. But it might be tempting for you to pray close to that and say, you know, God, thank you that you've helped me get so far, or helped me figure everything out. Thank you, God, for all my success. I thank you, God, for how you've taken care of this, and I've achieved this, and God, what a great family you've given me, and I thank you for all. And it's good to thank God for stuff, but if we don't watch out, we could forget who we are. in that. And Jesus says the Pharisee forgets completely who he is. God, I thank you I'm not like that. I fast and I pray and I give. But the tax collector, it says he just beats his chest and he says, God, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. And when you're trying to think of what you could pray about, there's worse places to start than just right there. To hang your head down in front of God and just say, God, have mercy on me. I'm a mess. Because we are. And it's healthy sometimes to admit that to the Lord, to say it out loud in your prayer. And Jesus says when those two guys leave, one guy goes home justified. And it's not the one you'd expect. It wasn't the guy who was righteous. It was the guy who was a mess. Because at least the guy who was a mess had the good sense to call out to God. And God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So how would humility look if you were to do it? Rick Warren has this quote, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's just thinking of yourself less. And if you were to ever meet a really humble person, they wouldn't do what I did earlier, what I said I did, where always putting themselves down. Oh, I'm no good at that, or I can't think about this, or because when you do that, you're still calling attention to yourself. You're still making sure that everybody looks at you. A really humble person doesn't do that at all. I mean, it might make you a little uncomfortable if you were with a completely humble person because they're completely at peace with life. I mean, they're not holding on to anything that tight. And they'd be really interested in what you had to say, and you'd notice it, how they just wanted to hear what you had to say, and they were concerned about what you wanted to do, and they just wouldn't be thinking about themselves at all. And I got to confess, I'm not there. I mean, I don't want to throw stones on this thing, and I doubt that most of you are there. That's what makes this a hard sermon to preach. Like I said, it's one of those sermons that we want to check that box pretty quick, and I don't think that most of us should. If I was completely humble, I'd be open to other people's opinions. I wouldn't be in a hurry to get my opinion out there. I just want to hear what they had to say. That doesn't mean you always give in. I mean, it would take some wisdom to know when you need to put your foot down, but I wouldn't put it down as often as I do, I don't think, if I really understood this. I'd be willing to go to the other person, even if the other person had kind of disappointed me. I'd be willing to go to the other person even if I thought it might be a hard conversation sometimes. I just wouldn't be thinking about what it's going to cost me. I'd be thinking about how it could help them. I'd be willing to admit that I was wrong in more than a nobody's perfect kind of way. I've done enough counseling with people who are in like a tough argument. It can be a family thing or a marriage thing or a neighbor thing or two brothers or two sisters or just for people who used to be friends, now they're not friends, two church people, and it's an intense conflict. And it's so intense that you can feel the tension, like we're all sitting down together and neither one of them really wants to totally acknowledge the other one. I mean, everybody's mad. Right? When we're sitting down, we're mad. And both sides are just waiting for the other side to say something that's going to light that fuse. And they're both hurt and they're both frustrated. And so maybe just as we talk about it, we say, well, can you think about things you've done to contribute to this? And it's a hard question to ask, I probably wouldn't ask it in front of everybody because they wouldn't admit it in front of the other person. But maybe privately, can you think of what you might have done to contribute to this? And what the normal answer for that is, and truthfully, what your answer would be to me if I asked you about it, would probably be something along the lines of, hey, listen, I know I'm not perfect. I know I've screwed up on this too. I know I've made some mistakes, but my goodness, let me tell you what they've done. And it's not that they can't deal with their wrongness, it's that they don't even see it. And if you and maybe like you have this argument and you go back home to your spouse, like you had this thing at work or you had this thing at church or you had this thing with your neighbor, and you go back to your spouse and you're talking to him about, I can't believe how this person was, and your spouse says something along the lines of, well, you're not always the easiest, and it just makes you mad all over when they say it. You're just instantly seeing red. I mean, how can you not see that any little stupid thing I did wrong pales in comparison to what they did? You know how that is? I mean, you all know how that is, right? I mean, we all know how that is. And it's not that you can't appreciate what you did wrong. You can't even see it. That's what pride is, and it's insidious. It sneaks in. We did an exercise a couple of years ago where I asked everybody, if you came in with someone, turn to that person and say, "It was me. I'm sorry. I was wrong." I had couples do it, and I was told afterward, 2 or 3 different couples came. I've never heard that before in my whole life, and I think they were joking. I don't think they were. I think it was a joke. I'm confident it was a joke. But I think that's probably true for a lot of people, right? I mean, we don't say that, and then if we do say it, we don't really mean it. Or if we mean it, we certainly expect you to say you're sorry pretty quick right back. Because, yeah, I may have done some bad stuff, but come on, you did worse, right? And so a really humble person, I think a person who was like this, they wouldn't do that. And I think I'm qualified to speak about this because I struggle with it. And so I want to talk about what we do. Keep in mind, as you're into all this thing, when I think about it in me, I don't have what's in me to fix it. I don't. We've talked about this verse every week of this sermon, this part of Ephesians. He says, as for you, or as for me, dead in my transgressions and my sins. Before Jesus got a hold of me, I was powerless to do the right thing. And truthfully, without Jesus in me, I'm still powerless to do the right thing. Even when I do the right thing, I hedge. Like I just talked about, right? Even when I admit that I'm wrong, I still hedge. Well, yeah, I'm wrong, but I'm not as wrong as, or I wasn't as mean as, I wasn't as cruel as the other person. But Jesus saw me in this mess and gave me grace. Amazing grace. Grace that taught me how to fear the Lord. Grace that taught me how to respond to the Lord. Through many dangers and toils and snares, His grace just keeps calling me. And even when I've been with Him for 10,000 years, He's still going to be giving me reason to praise Him and thank Him for His kindness to me. And it's not my work. It's all His grace. And He did it so that I could then be His handiwork, His masterpiece, and go represent Him to the world. Like I'm a painting by God, a work of art by God, to go out and show myself to the world, to show Him to the world. And I don't think about myself in that, I think about Him in that. And my whole life is an advertisement for Him, created to do good works in Him that He prepared in advance for me to do. But again, it's all in His power. And it's all because of what He does. So what do you do with all that? Now, we've talked about this every week. Let me admit my own humility in one thing. I am not proud enough to think that everybody has taken my advice on this. That's why I have repeated it every sermon. Because I know that when I'm out there, there's something about sitting in a pew. I don't know what it is. If I sit in regular chairs, I can think clearly. But sometimes when I sit in a pew, I think the preacher's talking to the person right beside me here, but he's not saying anything to me. And that may have happened to you. I don't know if it did or not. But just in case, let me go over it one more time. The first thing you have to do if you really want to take God seriously on this thing is you've got to seek His face every day. You've got to pray to God every day. You've got to read your Bible a little bit every day and ask God to get into your heart. I know that's little kid stuff, like that's junior church stuff, but it's just the truth. And if you're not doing that, if your days go by and you're never calling out to God and you're never trying to see what He says in His Word, then you're telling God that you don't need Him. That's what you're doing. And maybe you were baptized a long time ago and you think, well, I'm a Christian, I'm saved by grace, and that's all true, but it's still a dangerous thing, I think, to tell God day after day, week after week, month after month, I don't need you, God. But if I do, I know where you're at. So step one has to be that. We challenge people to read. We've done a program together as a church the last few years called the Life Journal Plan. It's kind of strenuous. It's 4 or 5 chapters a day. It takes a while to get through that, but if you read the 4 or 5 chapters a day, you get through the whole Bible in a year. But some people can't do that, and that's okay. You got to embrace your limitations on that too. Some people do really good, and they hit the desert that is Leviticus, and they fall off, or they get all the way to Ezekiel maybe, and they just can't go on. It's just too hard. I understand. I understand you started real good in March and April. You were still right on line. And then by the end of the summer, you were 6 weeks behind and you just haven't stuck with it. It's easy to get off track. Get back on track. And when I say get back on track, it's not even about getting back on this plan for a whole year. The point is not for you to get through the whole Bible. The point is for God to speak. So just do something. Proverbs has 31 chapters in it. Take a proverb a day, one chapter a day. Course of a month. If today is the 22nd, read Proverbs 22 today and just work your way through Proverbs. That's a great way to go. Or start in the book of Mark in the New Testament or Luke and just read about Jesus. Take a Jesus story every day and ask God, how would I have reacted to Jesus there? And what's Jesus trying to say to me? And you pray about it. God, have mercy on me. I'm a mess. And he will change you, but you've got to come and ask. You've got to put your heart in his hands because he already holds you there. That's the first thing. But then the second thing, once you've done that first very important step, I can give you some tips. And again, I'm pulling this from that book, The Life You've Always Wanted. You don't have to do all these things. You don't. I'm not even asking you to do all these things, but maybe one or two of these things will kind of strike you. If you want to work on your pride, the easiest thing to do is be willing to do small things. Just be willing to do small things, whatever those small things are. My daughter's in school in Indianapolis. She wants to be a nurse, and she's taking anatomy class as a lecture, and she's also taking anatomy labs where she can use what she learns in the lecture in practice, right? And God has put you in families, and God has put you in neighborhoods, and God's given you work, and so this is the lecture, and that's the lab. And so I'm telling you to think about working on small things, and when you're out there, there are certain jobs at your house that everybody avoids. At our house, it's washing dishes. We've talked about that before. Joey and I both can build on the sink like a Jenga tower, going the other direction. And until it topples over, we still can get more in there. We don't have to wash them yet. So washing dishes becomes this monster job whenever it is. And so you take your turn. And don't expect the other person to say anything about it, because they probably won't. Because if they say anything about it, it's like they're admitting it'll be my turn next, and they're not going to do that. So don't expect them to say thank you. They may not, but you do it anyway. And you're doing it not because of the job, though it's good to have clean dishes. You're not doing it because of the job. You're doing it because, why should I expect other people to do these small things? Why do I think I'm above all that? If you walk down to the kids' hallway downstairs, there's all these posters up about how precious children are to Jesus. He talks about it several times. The Bible goes on and on about how precious children are and how we're to look to children and raise them up right, and God cares about children. The greatest among you, he says, will be like a child. And you would think, with that in mind, how many different times Jesus talks about that anytime we said, hey, we need volunteers for anything with children, that we'd have to fight volunteers off, that the whole church would want to volunteer for that. Do you know that's not true? You know that's not what happens? If we ask for volunteers for a children's thing, most people who are sitting out there in the pews think the same thing that I would think if I was sitting out there. Boy, I hope somebody does that who's got time, who has a gift for that. It's just a weird thing that we do. We don't have time for small jobs. We have a way of making sure somebody else does that, whoever somebody else is. Sometimes the small job is your season of life. And we had one lady that I knew early in ministry, and before I had gotten to the church, was a real pillar there at the church, was just involved in everything, just did everything. And before I got there, really shortly before I got there, her husband left, and she had several small children there at home, and she was all by herself. And she would go work every day at a pretty demanding job. She's the only income. And she had different friends who would take turns watching the kids when they were before school, and then when they're in school, sometimes they'd be by themselves for an hour or two after school before she could get home. And she would get home and she would fix the dinner, and she would make whatever, had to clean a little bit if she could, to try to take care of the kids, finally get them all to bed, and she would pass out bone tired and get up and do it again. And that was every day. And we talked about it once, and she said how guilty she felt that she couldn't do more at church. And it was like, man, you're doing so much right now. Her whole life was small jobs. Her whole life was homework and baths and feed the kids and try to work as hard as you can and get home as quick as you can and handle everything. Her whole life was small jobs. And she felt like it wasn't impressive to God. And our God has a thing about small jobs, for whatever that's worth. He's an admirer of the people who do small jobs. Be interruptible. I'm not sure interruptible is a word. It didn't give me a spell check on it, so I left it. I'm not sure it's a word. So if you're an English grammar, how many of you are English grammar people? Oh, less than the Mesopotamian history people. That's interesting. All right. It's a surprise. All right. If you're a grammar person, check with me later. I'm not sure interruptible is a word. But if it is a word, it's descriptive because you should be able to be interrupted. We can tell a lot about how cocky and proud we are of ourselves by how we handle interruptions. Jesus is interrupted all the time. People are constantly interrupting Jesus, and he never blows up at them. He's on his way to heal somebody, and a woman grabs at his clothes and wants to get healed before he can get there. He's heading to one place or another, and he's trying to get some sleep on a boat as the disciples are going across, and they wake him up. Don't you care? We're about to drown. He's hanging on the cross, and the guy beside him says, you got a minute? And he always does, right? He always has time. Always has time. I can be a little cocky about this thing sometimes. I've got my plan and my agenda, and if you mess my agenda up, I can be mad about that. And Jesus never was. Now, I should mention that there is a time to say, I've got to get this done, whatever this is. I get that. There is a time to say, I just can't be interrupted for another hour, for 2 hours, or whatever. Fine. But that can't be the default setting for your whole life. It can't be. Chris Austin used to do that, would turn on the do not disturb on his phone and wouldn't take my calls. You take my calls. If I could make me so mad. And some of us live our whole life on do not disturb, right? Our whole life's on do not disturb. I got my own agenda. All right, embrace your limitations. We each get 24 hours every day, and that's all we get. And because we each get 24 hours every day, you won't be able to get everything done. So you've got to make sure that you do the right things. And it takes some wisdom. It takes some smarts. I heard one preacher say his schedule had just gotten really crazy. He just speaking here and speaking there and doing this other thing, and he's trying to write a book and all this different stuff. And last year I was in the airport 200 days, he said. And another preacher is in the same circle, and he says, well, why do you do that? And the first guy says, well, I never really thought about it. I thought your schedule was just what it was. You know, if the opportunity is presented to you, you got to take it. You know, it's kind of like being a Reds fan. Nobody would choose it, but if it's your lot in life, you just deal with it best you can. And that's what I thought it was. It wasn't just something you had to do. And the second guy says, well, no, I mean, why do you do it? You could say no. Why do you do that to yourself? And as he thought about it, the first guy says, well, I know if I started saying no, they'd quit asking, and that'd be awful. It was just pride. I've heard people get their life wrong on this thing. Yell at their husband or wife or yell at their kids. Can't you see I'm busy right now? I've got all this thing to do. And you're shutting people out who are your life. I mean, your family and your friends and your church. I mean, these really are the precious relationships that matter to you the most, and you shut them out. What's the Cats in the Cradle song all those years ago about the father who had no time for the kid, and then the kid grows up and he's just like his dad. And you'll have some regret if you don't embrace this limitation. You only have enough time to do some things. So make sure you choose the right things. Learn to hold your tongue. Now, this won't apply to all of you. It won't. But some people have to get the last word on everything. And again, they may not know who they are, but the people in their family know. Some people, you'll be sitting in a circle and everybody's talking about something and you immediately think of a funny story that would make you really sound intelligent or cool or smart, and I need to get that in there as quick as I can so people will like me. And sometimes it's good not to do that on purpose, just to not do it. Now, again, not always. I know at work you get promoted based on how impressive you are, and you've got to build relationships, and I understand there's a time for everything. But occasionally, It's a good thing just to listen. It's like lab, again, it'll make you humble. And then, last but not least, and this is the most important one, learn to be for people. I mean, you want them to succeed, and you want them to achieve, and you want them to accomplish. And in that way, you'll be very much like Jesus. He's kind even to the wicked and the ungrateful. And when you on purpose are kind to everybody, and you want them to come ahead, and you think about that more than you coming ahead, then you're like God, who gives rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. I mean, you become more like him. And once you get really good at that thing, you won't even really miss trying to make yourself the center of attention. Like I said, any of those things can make a big difference. If you can do all those things, you're a great one. It's just really hard to do. I read a joke a long time ago about a church that gave a prize to the humblest man in the church. They had a big plaque made up, and as soon as he accepted it, they had to take it back. So it's a weird thing that as soon as you start getting cocky about this, even that, it can mess you up. I just think it's the kind of thing we all need to work on. Now, because of the COVID thing, I still can't do invitation at the end of the service where we all get together and pray and do that, and I miss it. But the biggest step on being humble before God is to tell God that you need him. And if you've never done that, if you've never told God, God, I want you to run my life, then please come up after the service and let's have a conversation about that. I would like nothing better than to talk to you about that. And if you want me to, I'll stay 6 foot away with a mask and we can have that conversation. But that's the most important thing you can do. That's the thing that Belshazzar a long time ago didn't understand. God holds our whole lives in his hands, and you need to make sure you're right with him. The very basic first floor level of humility is just knowing where you stand with God. And if you've never done that, I invite you to do it today. I'm going to pray with you, and then Roger's going to come and lead us in communion.